So as usual, fairly meditative morning, but I want to allow a bit more time for any questions you might have, particularly about taking the practice into daily life. But you may have other questions, or you may not have questions. So I just want to allow a bit of space for that. And there's certainly some things I can say about taking the practice more into elements of work life. But we'll see how that goes. If there aren't particular questions, then we'll just do a bit more practice. So we will meditate in a few minutes, but beforehand I just wanted to say a little bit about where the practice might be going for you. So there's been a fair amount of emphasis on this quality of settling back, but also reminding ourselves to be aware, if you like, remembering, training the mind to get into the habit of checking in with ourselves. Is awareness present? What's the quality of the awareness? What's the quality of energy or effort like in this moment? So these questions are just really helpful, priming the mind to check in on how it's doing, really. Check in on the quality of the mind. Check in whether how we're relating to experience, so whether some degree of right view is present. But at a certain point, it becomes less necessary to do so much checking. It becomes possible to notice that the practice is working a bit more on its own, has got some degree of momentum. And this may be happening for you to some extent. So this touches in on the question that Garavavati asked yesterday. So if you like, when there's a certain degree of momentum with the awareness, then it starts to be able to sort of work on its own without that need to remind, if you like, that personal effort which needs to sort of remind to be aware, or to all those questions. So you might start to notice that the mindfulness spontaneously re-arises. In fact, there's this process, this comings and goings of mindfulness or awareness. So I've alluded to this as we've gone through this spontaneously waking up into awareness, and I think I talked about it as creating as few waves as possible. But if you like, this is even more sort of hands off. If there's enough momentum, if there isn't, then we will just find ourselves getting lost. But if you feel that the factor of mindfulness or the qualities of right mindfulness are quite well established, then you might have a feeling that they're sort of working on their own. Often, when we're not aware, is the factors of craving and aversion in their different guises that are working on their own. So this isn't anything new. It's just that because we cultivate certain factors, we're cultivating positive factors of mind, then they're the ones that, if you like, start gaining the positive habit of them strengthens, and they start sort of working in the mind. So what can happen if we don't quite realize that is that we can continue to do the reminding, if you like, we continue to put a certain amount of personal effort in, and this can get in the way. It can sort of interfere with something that's happening it's quite naturally. It's a bit like we need in the beginning, when we're learning to ride a bike or something, we do need to pedal, but once we've got going, that pedaling actually is a waste of energy, and it doesn't really do anything. Just every now and again, just need to sort of tap the wheels and keep going, to keep us going. So one of the things all along that I've encouraged you to notice, and you still notice at this point, is the mind. It is that sort of personal effort, the mind that wants to come in and do something, or change something, or interfere with something. But in this case, it will be doing things that perhaps earlier were considered helpful, the checking, the reminding. And now it's like you can just notice that happening, but you can notice it because it's already happening in awareness. So there can be a feeling of doing less and less, but actually the awareness has become more continuous. So it's important not to worry about feeling that you're doing less and less, as long as there's a clear sense of, but awareness is present. Awareness is present. There's right view is working in the mind, and that's enough. That's enough. In a way, you've set up the conditions for you've set up the conditions for wisdom to arise at some point. Moments of clearer seeing, moments of vipassana. So I think sometimes it's possible to get a bit hung up on this idea of continuity of awareness, and to try and sort of hold on to the mindfulness. Almost when you feel like it's going, or the mind is going on to something else, getting involved with thoughts or something, there can be a tendency to hold on. And something that was very important for me in one of my Burma trips was realizing that the more I allowed awareness to go, it's almost like letting go of awareness, but in awareness, then it would come back. The more I could be loose around that coming and going process, and not try and hold on, not try and control what was happening, that was much more conducive to the mindfulness re-arising quite quickly. So also at this sort of more subtle level, you might notice a more subtle sort of mind state that's a bit over-eager. It sort of jumps on experience. It's when sometimes effort gets a little bit corrupted by craving. And because there's it's like interest gone into this over eagerness, and that's just a little bit jumping on experience, a bit hypervigilant. So again, that really important, remembering to settle back. So when there's a certain amount of momentum, we can start to get really familiar with the quality of awareness, the flavor of awareness that's naturally arising and re-arising, and start to see how often it happens, how frequently actually there's another moment of awareness, or several moments of awareness. And we can start to tune in how effortless that process is, how it is just happening by itself at this point. and nobody is doing it. It's running on its own. And with this absence of controlling experience, it becomes possible at times to explore the experience of just being aware. How do I know I'm aware? In a way, that reflexive awareness being taking a look at awareness itself. What's that like? Yeah, so it can be important not to look too hard, just really, really open and gentle. The meditation teacher Andrea Feller says something like, it's like the air we breathe. We get a scent of the experience of awareness. So it's not something, again, that you can pin down, like so many things working with the mind, working with awareness. But we can know, and we can have confidence in that. So this is what I talk about as uncontrived mindfulness, or unprompted, when it has this quality of momentum and sort of going on its own, running on its own. Okay, so I think that's all I'll say for now. So let's sit. I'll lead us into a sit for about half an hour. So we start off in the usual way, just coming to the present moment, taking your own time to do that. It might be that quite quickly you land within one of the physical senses, land within the body, or connect with the sensations of breathing. Or it might be that you notice the movements of mind. Notice the attention, which is a little bit like a butterfly, moving very lightly from one thing to another, from a sound to a sight, to a sensation, and so on. So your way of settling might be just to go with, let awareness go where the attention goes from this very settled back position. It can be very interesting watching the attention, awareness following the attention. And attention may be maybe moving in certain ways due to our habits, samskaras. But it's also can be very helpful that we get a sense of it's also attention is happening on its own. When we just observe movement of attention in the mind, we're not directing it in any way. We're allowing it to move, and if we're present, then it can easily be known in awareness. Another way of talking about it is that we can settle back with the knowing of experience. At times, and we can't make this happen, but at times we find ourselves resting with objects or with the known, what's known, and at other times we can settle back with that knowing quality. That aspect of mind that is knowing, that is aware.
And not trying to recognize the awareness if it's not accessible in this moment. Sometimes it will be, sometimes it won't. Just know it as a possibility. And stay with recognizing what's obvious in your experience. Perhaps recognizing hearing. Different sounds in the sphere of awareness. And perhaps sometimes the experience of sounds arising into a space of awareness. Recognizing sounds, recognizing silence. Not as an absence, but a quality of experience. Allowing the mindfulness to come and go, come and go. And appreciating your mind for being willing to keep going. Mind that's willing to keep showing up moments of knowing, moments of awareness. And remembering to relax into awareness. Relax into spaciousness. Knowing the awareness at certain points in practice, and at other points recognizing objects, sounds and sights, sensations. Some of the objects may be thoughts or images, points of view in the mind. Recognize awareness is knowing, thinking. Awareness, knowing, hearing. Awareness, knowing, liking or disliking in the mind. Welcoming the mindfulness when we recognize it's returned. We're present again. And whatever we're present to is secondary. And what's primary is the awareness in this moment, and this one, and this one. Sometimes it can seem like there are more objects arising in awareness. And we can get a bit confused, feeling that perhaps the mind is becoming distracted. But at this point, if we can really relax the mind, relax the body, recognize that the mind is actually knowing more. It's able to have a more subtle awareness that can recognize experience from different senses. And at times this can feel like a global awareness or a panoramic awareness. Recognizing awareness can be like recognizing the air all around us that we breathe in and breathe out. Catching a glimpse of the scent or the flavor of awareness. How it feels in the body and mind. What is the mind knowing in this moment? Through all the six senses. And what can you know about the flavor of awareness itself? How does the awareness feel in the mind? Taking whatever is obvious as an object in experience. Awareness can know whatever is happening, whatever is being experienced, without judgment, without preference, simply knowing. And an awareness can illuminate those judgments and preferences arising in the mind. And relate to them as simply more objects to be known. Awareness has the quality of curiosity about what is being known.
So we have a little bit of time if anyone would like to share anything of their experience during that practice, or it might be something that's happened outside of formal practice, that it was just perhaps a moment of clear seeing, or a moment of presence, or something that really caught your interest. So Bante says something like, he says, moments of insight, which is not necessarily what I'm asking you for, but moments of insight. He says sometimes we're, in formal practice, we're trying a bit hard. So actually the fruits of practice can come when we're just going about our daily life. We're just sort of present to some degree. He talks about chopping potatoes, peeling potatoes, that's right. Anyway, so you may have had one of those moments rather than within practice. Moksha.
I sort of, what was going on in that last sit was getting interested in thoughts, and particularly thoughts seem to have this accompaniment of words in a way that when I'm allowing hearing, objects of hearing to come in, it seems that's a lot quieter now, the kind of need to say what it is. It's more a sense of just blowing through a bit more. But I noticed then in that sit, it's like, oh, there's a thought. Oh, and I'm labeling that thought with more words, and then, oh, there's another thought, and it just felt really confusing, I guess. And then coming back to the more bodily sensations as a way of giving that a break. But it just felt like there was just more and more objects of mind trying to present themselves as awareness. And then it's like they were sort of taking off a t-shirt going, ha ha, no, not really, and ha ha, not, and it was just, oh, it's too much. It just felt like it just left me with, I don't know what awareness is. I just
Yes, I think that sometimes that can happen with thoughts. So we can tie ourselves in knots a little bit, or it can seem like they are tying themselves in knots around us. So remembering to settle back, just really settle back, and sometimes I find the question: how does a thought feel in the mind? It can help with that sort of excessive sort of or sort of almost automatic sort of mental labeling. Having said that, I think it can be a way, if you can settle back from it, then you can sometimes experience the different types of thinking that I was sort of talking about yesterday in the meditation. There's sort of there's a type of thinking that's quite sort of heavy going. It makes heavy weather out of a thought, and it seems to have to be really I think I use the word sort of weighty, or sort of definite. So sometimes the thought happens and just happens in awareness, but then there's something else comes in that wants to really make sure, really sort of establish itself in some way as a thought, and it can be quite interesting to watch the different sort of ways that thoughts and thinking sort of manifest, but from a more spacious and open place. Great. Anyone else? There are there's things that escape awareness. So the things that sometimes feel really important, they say, I'm too important to be aware of. You just got to believe that I'm important, this wanting to know is really important, and just being able to recognize, oh, this one isn't important, you know, that they have, where there's identification, I suppose, where there's identification with it. So it's not all of, and you know, settling back is helpful, but it's that clear knowing of what's happening. Otherwise, I think it can start to feel a bit frustrating. It's like everything, you know, if that identification isn't seen for what it is, then it continues, and I think it can set up a bit of tension between, you know, the practice is to settle back, and yet there's this thing that feels important, and if somehow it still feels important, it hasn't quite been seen clearly. But it's that seeing clearly that I think can make the practice feel really interesting, and the release from that sort of clear knowing, and sometimes a sense of the powerfulness of certain qualities that keep us in delusion or keep us in craving, and the sort of release from those, which comes from seeing through them. And where the settled backness helps, it's that it's a better position, if you like, in order to be able to see more clearly. So that's why it's really important, not for its own sake so much, but just because it supports seeing clearly. And it's nothing wrong with whatever it is, you know, the thoughts that think they're important. Nothing wrong with that, but it needs to be sort of seen in, oh right, okay, so this is what this thought thinks. It thinks it's so then we can miss a degree of sort of belief in it. But maybe just to say one more thing, so it's to do, I might have said it already, but it's to do with in a way the being prepared to sort of practice. It's the difference between practicing, being happy to practice, and practicing in order for some sort of result. So that difference between being happy to practice in the present moment. You know, we do need to have some idea of the goal in mind, but if that is coming into the present moment a lot, then it can impact. It's like we then get quite sort of future oriented. That may not have been what was happening in your experience, but it's worth sort of bearing in mind that desire to practice is a sort of generally a wholesome one, but the desire for a result is often going to be sort of some sort of craving in operation. And we can sort of feel that out within ourselves. How, because the desire to practice will be what in this moment needs to be seen, or how best to support the working of awareness and wisdom and right effort. But it's all about creating conditions, and we don't know when those will bear fruit. We don't know in terms of our overall sort of karmic stream. In a way, there's a sense of not being in control of that, but at the same time, a certain confidence can come from knowing or feeling that we're the conditions, we are putting the conditions in place moment by moment. And maybe just really checking the you're working with right view, or working with that sort of clarity of knowing can it can sort of balance, it can balance things. So within that receptivity is a sort of active subtly active intelligence that's sort of recognizing what's happening. It has that Dharma perspective. Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else? Dharmavasta.
I think I just had one moment this morning. And I think you must have just said clearly knowing, or it just came to my mind, but I had this sort of pain in my shoulder, and I had an experience of awareness of it, which wasn't as close to it as it normally is. So when it gets, so I suppose that's where the clearly knowing and settling back go together. Normally I'm so close to it that then I start trying to do things with it physically, or there's distress or anxiety or anxious thoughts. I just had this moment where I could see it a bit more clearly and disidentify with it, I suppose. So I think I've just heard these words clearly knowing for the first time after all these years. Just getting a sense of what that might mean.
Yeah.
So I found it quite useful what you were just saying just now about settling back isn't the whole story. You do need this. I suppose the clearly knowing is includes the wisdom aspect.
Yeah. And at different times that will be more prominent. I mean, they work in tandem, and from a certain perspective, right view is the primary condition, really. I mean, I don't tend to teach it that way, but from because it's so easy for the more active part to not be done. It's sort of in the service of the receptive mode. It's easy for it to sort of conjoin with yet more activity and more sort of perhaps more common way of personal effort and taking charge of it. So yeah, but yeah, the right view perspective. Yeah, I could quote a number of different people, but they would say, yeah, that's the primary thing, is to be pointing in the right direction. Yeah, we can be aware of what we like, but if we're not pointing in the right direction, we haven't got that sort of Dharma perspective, then all the awareness in the world is not necessarily going to take us where we want to go. Yeah.
Thank you.
But I'm sure you have heard clearly knowing before, Dharmavasta. I know you have. and I think we can hear it really in the moment. It can seem like, oh, wow, that's fresh, or we can hear it in a slightly more significant way or something.
Yeah, I think you go around, and each time you go around, you go, aha, I get it now. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it goes a bit further in each time, I guess.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else, or any questions you might have, or comments you have to just about the practice, or an aspect of the practice, or how it might travel more into your life, if that's what you would like. And Zoom retreats are interesting because to some extent we are in our lives. So I think I said at the beginning, we've got that sort of intermediate territory of a friend of mine described it as when she's sitting in a particular room in her house, that's her retreat room, and then she opens the door, and then that's her life. It's just a door away, just an open door away is the rest of her life, is her husband, is her dogs, is her your worries about her extended family, and all that. So to some extent, we have been practicing in daily life already. Garavati.
I don't know if this is a bit too vague, but I think my question is, or maybe it's more my own experience, is that I think a lot of the time I lose awareness when I'm in communication with people. I get sort of like drawn in to someone else's experience, or that, you know, I lose track of my sort of self or something. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts or tips of how to sort of maintain the practice in communication.
Great, yeah, great. I think it's not a vague question at all. I think it's a huge area and extends on from the whole area of thinking. You know, in a way, our thoughts are we speak our thoughts. So come around roundabout way. So generally in Burma, it's a very strict version of the Satipatthana Sutta. Completely silent retreats, and you know, you don't really look at each other very much. You sort of guard the, what do they call it, the custody of the eyes. I think it's a Christian tradition way of saying so you don't look at people. The tradition in which I've done almost all of my retreats, I have done a couple of retreats in that very strict tradition, but Sayadaw U Tejaniya, who I've mostly learnt about this practice from, he does something called talking meditation. And he says it's because if we're, which is not the case for us in Triratna, but if generally we're on retreat and we're in silence, we're practicing intensive mindfulness, let's say, but we never get a chance to practice while speaking. We just go home and we just adopt all our usual habits, and it is really common, I think, to lose awareness while in communication with somebody else. I think it's easier, perhaps with one other person, to try and take awareness through. But in a group situation around a dinner table or something like that, it's very hard. So there's a few things I can say. I sometimes do talking meditation practice at the end of a retreat. Probably best done in person rather than on Zoom. So one thing is to think about who is the priority in this situation. And I think there can be a view in the mind that when we're in communication with somebody else, that they are more important, that they are the one that we're attending to. I think there's lots of sort of conditioning around that. But actually, from a certain perspective, we are more important. The more that we can sort of, in a way, prioritize our own awareness of what's happening within us. It doesn't mean we won't be able to recognize what's happening, but the more tuned in we are with ourselves, the actually, I think, the better the communication goes. And I think within Triratna, we do have a context with quite a lot of emphasis on speech in relation to the precepts. But this is slightly different, and it's you know, when I'm speaking, I can be aware certainly of my body. I can be aware of the sound of my voice. I can be aware of what my hands are doing. I can be aware of how calm or how agitated the body is, how eager or not the mind is to say things that impact on how I listen to somebody else. I can particularly be aware of that leaning in to somebody, and quite a lot of stuff around nodding, around often brings quite a lot of tension in the body to try and let the other person know that I'm really listening. So there are all sorts of sort of habits that in a way impact on us being a little bit more balanced within our own hearts and minds, within our awareness. When we do these talking meditation exercises, some of the most difficult bits are people when they're listening to somebody else, and they really want to nod. They you know, the idea is that they don't talk. It's a little bit like communication exercises. So you know, somebody is talking and you're listening in awareness. So because the listener is not meant to be speaking initially in the exercise, then the desire to nod, to lean in, all those sort of non-verbal things where we are sort of reassuring each other that we are listening, that they become really apparent. They become really apparent how hard it is to not do that. So and it's not that we don't do those, but at the same time, they can impact on this feeling of balance, this feeling of being aware in ourselves. One way some friends of mine practice talking meditation, or learning to speak with awareness carrying through, was that some of you will have heard this. They're two brothers, and they basically read War and Peace aloud to each other. I think I haven't read it myself, but it's a very, very long book. And they read it, and by the time they'd finished reading, they felt that they understood and they could practice talking meditation. It's a slightly artificial way of doing it, but actually it had the effect of being able to be present while speaking, and also listening. So really, I think it's, yes, that's probably, it's practice. It's like anything. It's practicing and realizing that it is possible. Sometimes just maybe setting yourself a little bit of an intention to be aware in what you know is going to be a short conversation. So you're not, you're not making your goal too big, and keeping maybe coming back every now and again to sense of the body and grounded in the body. What's I going to say? I know what I was going to say. I know not everybody has this experience, but quite often people can find conversations or a lot of talking draining. It drains the energy. And I remember being really surprised with U Tejaniya saying, if you're practicing well with awareness and meditation, and we know this about meditations, that by on at the end of the day on retreat, if you're practicing well, then the mind is refreshed. There's actually more energy, and it's exactly the same with talking meditation. So rather than talking or conversing being something that can, and as I say, not everybody is like this, but can drain attention. Actually, you can have the experience not just being enlivened by the topic of communication, but actually feeling like you're more aware at the end of a conversation. Sometimes, just maybe one last thing is, it can be helpful to practice while listening. So there isn't necessary, you don't necessarily have an active part, but just to stay aware while listening. So you're doing sort of half of the conversation. And I've definitely had the experience there of prioritizing the awareness. So sometimes there's a slight compromise on actually understanding what's been said. There's less, isn't that reaching out? That's prioritizing the awareness and having the experience at the end of, there's 2 hours, actually 2 hours of listening to people talk about their meditation experience within a group setting, and having the teacher responding to it. And it was amazing how I could really feel that the mindfulness felt very different to how it felt at the beginning of that session. Whereas I'd had many experiences of feeling quite drained at the end of 2 hours of listening to, it's interesting stuff, but the mind would get quite tired. So it's not inevitable. It's not inevitable. And the more we can be aware, the more the mind will feel refreshed. Is there anything coming back from you around that? Any further sort of?
No, it's great actually. I think it feels quite exciting. It's very positive, I think, to think about being enlivened by communication rather than drained by it, because I think that can, I'm in a situation where I'm in communication a lot of the time, and I sometimes feel like I'm trying to defend myself to create space for me to sort of process everything. So I think it's really, it sounds challenging, but it sounds exciting as well. Yeah,
good. Good. Yeah. I'll come to you in just a sec, Dharmavasta, and I'm just gonna I've just realized there's something about the reading in itself, I think, can be a really good awareness practice, particularly talked about it in relation to exploring talking meditation, but I read quite a lot, and I have I would say I have at times quite a compulsive relationship to reading, really wanting to sort of slurp it in. And practicing reading meditation is quite challenging, because the priority is not on slurping up the story, if it's fiction, or taking in a lot of information, but being aware. And initially I found I'd have to read something 2 or 3 times. I'd have to read the same paragraph to feel that I understood what had been taking in, because the focus was not on the thinking mind, understanding in that way. It was on awareness, taking in. So I'd notice seeing, and that breadth of seeing. I'd notice the touching sensations of my hand holding the book or the Kindle. Far sort of broader awareness going on, but I couldn't quite manage to take in what was said. And I said something of this to Utejani, and he said, "Oh yeah, don't worry, it changes. It's one of those things that changes. You get a bit more proficient at it, and the mind can do the 2 things at the same time. It can understand as well as have this breadth of awareness. But initially, it's like there's a bit of learning how to be aware in that situation. And actually, it's so much more relaxing when I can do it, when I can just have that sort of softening around reading. It's more relaxing for the eyes. Again, it has this feeling of the awareness doesn't sort of stop. There can be this continuity of it through different activities. So I just wanted to add that. Yeah, it is helpful to choose something, if you're practicing reading meditation, to choose something that you don't just want to gobble up. If I try and do it with one of my favorite thrillers, then it's much harder. But if I do it with the Dharma book, and I think it's the same with talking and reading, if the content is, say if I'm reading about awareness, actually those words sort of trigger, mindfulness, awareness, whatever it is, practice. Lots of words will trigger a remembering to be present, and those words don't crop up so often in my thrillers. So Dharma Vasta, you had a question or something?
Oh, it was just in this secular mindfulness course I've been doing, they have this 50-50 practice. I don't know if you've seen it. It's where you have an object and you play around with focusing 100% of your attention on the object, or 80% of attention on your object, and then back to yourself. It's quite contrived. I don't know how useful it is, but it just it was interesting playing around with the being more out there or more back here.
Yeah, great. Yeah, no, I think it sounds helpful. You can sort of find something where you feel is sort of optimal for a sort of light awareness of definitely tuned in with yourself, but also aware of other and surroundings.
Yeah, it was called the 50-50 practice. It was just interesting to play with.
Yeah. No, I think I've actually heard U Tejaniya say something like that as well. Thank you. Any last things before we wind up? And I'm going to just read something from Andrea Feller, who I mentioned before, which some of you will be familiar with this particular reading. So I think it's just a very important area, and she says it really well. And having said that, she says it very well, and it's also I've transcribed it from a talk, so some of it, the language sounds slightly unusual. Okay, there goes the paint scraper again. So she says, when I see the mind start to touch that more or less mindful place where the momentum slowly starts to go down, sometimes you can recognize the attention is starting to go onto something else. And we may have an agenda about where we want that attention to be. So usually we call the attention back. But another exploration might be, oh, the attention is going someplace else. Let's see where it wants to go. That exploration, that one practice or question, for me has been one of the most powerful ways for the mindfulness to learn to be, or how to be, with unfamiliar experience, with new terrain in which I've not been previously familiar with being mindful. One time I was doing the mindfulness of breathing when I began to recognize the quality of being more or less mindful of the breath. And initially I was gently bringing the attention back to the breath. At some point, the mind got curious. I could see that the mind was leaving the breath, but I was still aware. So why don't I just see what it wants to do rather than controlling it, saying, come back to the breath. Let's see where it wants to go. And it was like the mind opened. I'd never been aware of that state of mind before. It was almost like just before you go to sleep, where there is a drop and expand moment, and being able to stay there. Noticing the mindfulness is present with the attention. Noticing what the mind is naturally picking up upon. There are so many experiences, so many objects that we have no idea about. We have no possibility of imagining their reality or their formation. We just have no idea. And if we are always choosing where our attention goes, we will limit what we're able to be aware of. At some point, we have to let go of the control of where our attention is, to allow the mind to begin to explore terrain that is unknown to it, that we have no idea about. We are not going to find our way to nirvana. We have no idea what we're looking for. We have to have the ability to allow the mind to explore something that we don't know. So watch where the mind wants to go. Sometimes it can be, wow, I have no idea what's going on here, but I'm aware. You could not possibly even name the object because it's so unfamiliar, but you know that you're aware, and just hang out there knowing that.